We are in the third week of a series called Jumpstart, and throughout this series, what we're really looking to do is we're saying, okay, new year, 2024, how can we jumpstart some of the relationships that we have, some of the domains of life that are of value to us? And so in week one, we talked about probably for us as Christians, the most important area, which is how do we jumpstart our relationship with Jesus? Last week, we talked about how do we jumpstart or make an impact in our workplaces. And like I mentioned, today we're going to talk about parenting. But before we get into parenting, I'm going to share something. I think a lot of you know this about me because I don't necessarily hide it. But I'm not a handyman at all. Like I like construction projects, building, working with my tools. Like it's not my thing. But every once in a while, I'm sort of required to make it my thing because, if I don't do it, I have to hire someone to do it, and people cost money. And so, sometimes you got to make those tough decisions. Well, a few years ago, we had an issue. We have a deck off the side of our house, and there's stairs down from the deck into the backyard, and those stairs, they broke. Like apparently over time, if they're not mounted or connected to the ground, the weight will kind of crack it. And so that's what happened. And so I'm looking at this thinking, okay, we don't have the money to hire someone to fix it right now. So I'm going to have to tackle this project myself, but I have no idea what I'm doing. And so I have all sorts of anxiety around, well, how do I do this? How do I fix it? And so fortunately these days there's a thing called YouTube. And so I'm like, okay, I'll go to YouTube and I'll research it. So, smart people will tell me how to do this, and so I'm watching YouTube, and I'm trying to take in all the information, and I realize it's just making me more anxious about the whole thing. Like prior to that, I'm like, oh, you take a few pieces of wood, you put it together, and voila, stairs. And that's what the scope of what I thought I was getting into. But as I'm watching YouTube, they're talking about the rise and the run and what's appropriate, and I'm like, what is a rise and what is the sun rises, but I don't know what else arises or the run of a stair. And so I'm freaking out about this, but I'm like, I have to tackle this because no one else is going to fix it. My wife, she'll do it, but I want to take this on and be a contributor to the family. And so I'm like, go to Home Depot. I start asking questions. They're looking at me like this guy has no idea. He's going to kill his family on these stairs. And so I buy all the stuff. I get home, and what I think is a few-hour project ends up being a weekend project. And I'm trying to figure it out. I make a measurement, and I seemingly measure wrong, and I make a cut, but then I've cut wrong, and so I have to go back and get more wood. And finally, after 2 days, I feel like I get to this place where I'm like, okay, we have stairs now. There's functional stairs that lead out to the backyard, and you would think in that moment that I have this overwhelming self of accomplishment. In pride, the work that I've done, but as I'm looking at it, as it's completed, there's none of that. There's still the same anxiety. And so I start to reflect, why is that? I'm supposed to have pride in the work. This is what men do. Men do handiwork. And when we accomplish something, we're supposed to be proud about what we've done, but yet this is accomplished, and why do I feel this way? And so, again, I start to reflect, what's going on with me? And here's what I realize. Even though the project is finished, even though it's generally arrived at a place where I think it's going to be functional, 2 years later, they still work. So there was obviously something I did right. In that moment, I find myself questioning whether or not I did it right. Right? Okay, it works, it's functional, but did I do it right? Did I do it as I was supposed to? Is there something I missed? And as I've kind of thought more on it, I realized that's part of the reason why I don't like to do handiwork. Because I have no experience, I have no understanding, no knowledge, and so every time I do something, it's is this right? Is it right? Is it gonna break in a year? Even if it doesn't break, it's supposed to be perfect, and part of that's just my personality. To be right has to be perfect. It has to be done the way it was supposed to get done. Now, maybe that's not you. Maybe you're no, I just slapped some stairs together. If it's still working 2 years later, it worked. We're all different, but here's what I would say. Each and every one of us has an area in our life that we want to get right. Most of it is these relational areas that are important to us. When we think about marriage, we want to get our marriage right. When it comes to our jobs and careers, we want to do it right. We want to excel. Sometimes when it's our hobbies, same thing. I got to get this right. I don't want to be just a hack out there on the pickleball court. I got to be good at this. I got to get it right. Well, I believe one of the other areas where we feel compelled to get it right is when it comes to parenting. I haven't met a parent who was yeah, I have kids. I don't know what I'm doing. Whatever. We'll see how this goes. Like, parents don't approach it like that. Parents are like, okay, I have kids. I got to figure out how to do this because I want to get it right. And the truth is, what statistics tell us is that we don't know if we're getting it right. There is a Christian research group known as the Barna Research Group, and they conducted a survey a few years ago, and they asked questions about parenting. And this is some of the things that they sort of concluded. Here's what they found. 56% of parents lack confidence in their parenting. I mean, tell me if you can relate to that. You can raise your hand. I'll raise my hand. Do you lack confidence in your parenting? Again, about half the room. Like, there's these moments where I'm like, I don't know if this is the right call. Like, I don't know if this is the right move. And so we question, but we want to make sure we get it right. Now, it's not just that. Like, there's more questions that they asked as a part of the study, and it just sort of reinforced we want to get it right. But the other thing they found was 80% of parents want more information on how to improve their relationship with their kids. Like, again, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't have the confidence in what I'm doing. Please give me more information on how I can get this right. And let me tell you what I think is important, but it's going to sound counterintuitive. I think instead of focusing on getting it right, it's important for us to define what it is. Right? Because we're like, I got to get it right, I got to get it right, I got to get it right. I want to be a good parent. And so we focus on getting it right, but we don't know what it is. Now, it is the goal of parenting. It is what we're striving after. If you don't know the goal, and for some of us, we don't know the goal, you will miss the target every time. And in case you're sitting here thinking this morning, well, I don't have a goal of parenting. I'm not missing the goal because I don't have one. Let me just tell you, we all have goals when it comes to parenting. Now, we might not state what those goals are. It might not be clear. We might not cognitively understand what the goal is, but we have something that we're parenting towards. And so let me just give you a few examples. Some of us are parenting towards raising up functional human beings. Like, I just want them to be contributors to society. I want them to be a positive impact on society. I've maybe not articulated it, but this is the goal when it comes to my parenting. For others of us, it's career success. Like, work hard in school, get an education, go out there, be good at what you do, make a lot of money to support your family. That might be our parenting goal. For some of us, it's a college scholarship. Like, I'm gonna dedicate, I'm gonna invest in you playing these sports or getting these tutors so that you can give all that you have so that you can get a college scholarship. Maybe that's not the end goal, but that might be what we're parenting towards. Some of us are parenting towards having kids who have happy marriages. Like, I want you just to grow up. I want you to meet someone. I want you to settle down and just have a happy, good marriage. Each and every single one of us are parenting towards a goal. Again, we might not know what it is, but we have a goal. Now, here's the scary reality of parenting. And it comes from the words that Paul wrote in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Paul said this. He says, "You will always harvest what you plant." And so you can see why it's important for us to understand what the goal is. Because at some point, there's a strong likelihood that what we are planting in our kids will ultimately harvest. And so if we know that what's called the principle of the harvest, if we know that this is a reality, then wouldn't it behoove us to actually define what we want it to be? Like, to have some clarity of saying, there's 1,000 things we could parent towards, but what is the thing that we should parent towards? Knowing that if we don't define the goal, we might miss it. We'll hit something in our parenting, but it might not ultimately arrive at the place we want it to be. Now, I get that there is an abundance of resources that are available for us as parents. Like, there's books that people have encouraged you to read. I remember when we were having our first kid, everyone was like, oh, you got to read this book, and you got to read this book. And so, I was reading the books. I'm like, well, this book says something different than this book. And this book over here counters this book and doesn't support this book. It can be overwhelming. And so I realize whether it's books or podcasts or just the internet, there is a plethora of resources when it comes to how we can parent. But I don't want to look at any of that. I don't want us to look at the most current, hot tips on parenting. Instead, I want us to look at the scriptures. Because I think in the Bible, we start to get a framework for what it looks like to parent with the long game in mind, to parent with the it that God calls us towards. And so we're going to kind of walk through this together. But before we get into that, let me just make some statements just so we're on the same page. The Bible actually has very little real-world parenting examples. Like when you read the scriptures, there's not a ton of real-world examples when it comes to parenting. And matter of fact, some of what you do see is probably like these dysfunctional families. And so you can almost for a moment be like, well, why do we look at the Bible if what we see when it comes to families and relationships in the Bible is kind of dysfunctional? Like, why should we be looking at? Shouldn't we be looking at healthy families? Well, the truth is, again, there's not a lot of clear guidance in Scripture when it comes to how to build a healthy family, specifically around parenting. Again, bad examples, like we looked at, Cain killed his brother Abel, not a great example. Abraham got his wife's maid pregnant, not a great example. Jacob stole his brother's birthright, not a great example. Joseph's brothers tried to kill him, threw him into a pit, left him there, not a great example. And here's the thing, that's just the book of Genesis. That's just the first book of the Bible. And again, you're looking at these where are the good examples? Now, again, there's not a lot of great parenting examples, but there is a key principle that supports and guides everything we do as parents. And really, it's not just a parenting principle. In what Jesus says sort of lays the groundwork for how Christians should live out every facet of their lives. Again, if you don't have kids, universally applicable. Jesus didn't intend what he said right here to be only for parents, but as parents, we can learn something from this. Now, what I'm about to read, Sherry kind of read as a part of the baby dedication moment, but it will reinforce this idea. This is what Jesus says in Mark 12, beginning in verse 29. Jesus replied, he was asked sort of what is the most important commandment that we should tell people to follow. This is Jesus' response. The most important commandment is this: listen, O Israel, the Lord our God is one and the only Lord. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. The second is equally important: love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. I mean, what Jesus says is this is the most important commandment: to love God and to love other people. You could almost say one of the central ethics of being a follower of Jesus is to be other-centric. To focus on your relationship with God, that's important, but to also focus on the interactions and relationships you have with other people. And so here's what I believe. In these words, Jesus gives us that sort of goal. This is what it is when it comes to parenting. And there's two principles that we're going to talk through to help define it so that we're clear on what he's getting at. This is the first one. If you want to parent with the long game in mind, prioritize your relationship with Jesus. It starts with you and it starts with me. If we want to raise our kids up, and if faith is an important part of our lives, then we need to focus first and foremost on our relationship with Jesus. It's why we began in week 1, this is the foundation. This is what everything else comes out of, that we grow and deepen our relationship with Jesus. And this is not just something we see here, we see this commanded among people throughout the scriptures. There's a famous story in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Moses has just spent some time with God, and God gives him the 10 commandments, and he's beginning to share these things with the people of Israel. But this is what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1. Moses says, "These are the commands, the decrees, and the regulations that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you. You must obey them in the land you are about to occupy." Moses says, look, everything that God taught me, I'm sharing it with you. The commands, the laws, the decrees, everything just as God directed. But I need you to understand that what I've taught you doesn't just stop with you. And I think sometimes we don't take that natural progressive next step. Like, what is taught to me should go beyond me. Moses tells us in verse 2, it's not just you, and your children and your grandchildren must fear the Lord as long as they live. We sung about this in that song, The Blessing. Like, it's the generational impact that comes from prioritizing your relationship with Jesus. Like, it has to begin with you. And it doesn't mean like every morning I have to like open up my Bible in front of my kids so they see me reading my Bible so they know that's a value. Yeah, that's important. That's a part of it. But it's also beyond that. Like, do your kids see in you what you profess to believe, what you say is important for them to believe? Do they see it play out in your life day in and day out? See, if you and I want our kids to have a deep relationship with God, it starts with us. It starts with us prioritizing that in our lives. But here's the key. It means that we also have to be authentic with it. And I think sometimes as Christians, we think, okay, I have to look all perfect. I have to put it all together. I can't let my kids see my flaws, because if they see my flaws, then I think they're going to question what it is that I say that I believe. But here's what I would tell you. One of the best things that you can do with your kids is to be transparent with your flaws, to be transparent with some of your struggles. Again, in an age-appropriate way, but to be open. Like, hey, kids, I struggle to live this out. Or when it's clear that you do not do what you say you believe, that you would circle back with your kids and say, hey, I dropped the ball there. I missed the mark. I'm not trying to be perfect, but I'm being honest. And I'm on this journey towards Jesus, and I want you to journey with me. Because I think what happens when we put up this like perfect persona exterior, then it creates an unreachable standard for our kids. Like, they look at it and they go, okay, well, apparently to be a Christian, you can't mess up, or you can mess up, but then you just never acknowledge it because they see all the ways that we fall short. But if we never circle back and say, hey, that was my bad, or hey, I messed up. Even last night I was with my youngest, I was putting her to bed, and this is the byproduct of having those honest conversations. She says, Dad, I didn't like when you did this. I didn't like how this went down. And I listened to what she said, and I said, sweetie, you're absolutely right. Daddy messed up there. And I'm going to make amends for it. I'm going to apologize. I'm going to work towards growth. Versus like not talking about it or not even acknowledging when she says something like, no, like we don't mess up. We're Christians. Like, we put an unreasonable standard on ourselves that makes it impossible for our kids to adhere to. And so the goal here is to prioritize our relationship with Jesus in a way that reflects the reality of following Jesus. And then here's the counter to that. Our kids are very good at seeing a hollow faith. Because this is about more than just coming to church on Sunday. Our kids are very tied in and attuned to what happens Monday through Saturday. And so if you want your kids to grow up in a relationship with Jesus, understand that they will ultimately, in some way, reflect in their lives what they saw in yours. And that's hard. That's a sobering thing for us as parents. But we have to understand, it begins with us. Now, the second thing that I would encourage you with is to prioritize a relationship with your kids. And I think, of course, we'll be, obviously I want a relationship with my kids, but what does that look like to parent with a relationship in mind? And I want to be clear here, because I feel like different generations, there was kind of different approaches to this, and there was a season where it's you need to be your kid's best friend. That's not what I'm advocating for. You still need to parent. You still need to help hold them accountable. You still need to challenge them in the places that they need to challenge and grow. You need to discipline them, because discipline is a part of parenting. But you do these things with the relationship in mind. Because if you remember what Jesus said when he sort of gave us the Christian ethic, how we're supposed to live our lives, it's not just that we love God, but it's that we love other people. We don't just pursue God and prioritize God in our lives, but we also prioritize the relationships that we have in our lives. And as we talk about parenting, principal to that is our relationship with our kids. And this is why it's so important. Again, a lot of it just reflects back to us. What our kids see in us helps form for them what they see in Jesus. And so if we don't prioritize and pursue relationship with our kids, what they see is ultimately a God that has no priority or desires no relationship with them. And so, what does it look like for us to put relationship at the forefront? Understanding that how our kids experience our love is a byproduct of some of the love they believe that is possible from God. Now, I really believe that every relationship is grounded on some level in love. Like relationships, especially with our kids, there's a key component of love that is a part of those relationships. And the Bible talks a lot about what love is, and probably one of the most famous scriptures about love is found in words that the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. And this is what we read in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, in verse 4, Paul would say that love is patient and kind. Now, Paul goes on and says a lot about what love isn't. He says, look, love isn't jealous, it's not boastful, it's not rude, it's not demanding, and he continues, I'm not so concerned with what Paul says love isn't. I think we should focus on what Paul says love is. And what he says love is patient and kind. And I think when you get down to it, patience is kindness. And I'll just speak for myself, but I know I'm not alone. As parents, a lot of us lack patience. We can struggle, when we ask our kids to do something, and we're very clear with what we want them to do, and then they don't do it, our patience goes right out the window. And then we respond to our kids in that moment. And when we have no patience in that moment and we're responding to our kids, do you think kindness comes out in our response? No. They get all of our frustration, all of our angst, all of our anger. This is what they get because we lacked patience in that moment. And again, I understand, there's times where you need to be very clear with your kids and they're supposed to do something and they don't do it. But how we respond shows whether or not in that moment what we value is the task to get done or the relationship that we have with our kids. And what I want to encourage you is to prioritize the relationship. And guys, I don't get this right all the time. I have a temper. I can get frustrated. I lack patience. And so my kids bear the brunt of this day in and day out. So I want to be clear, I'm not standing up here as a parental expert who's got this all figured out. I'm on this journey with you. Figuring out how do I prioritize day in and day out my relationship with Jesus? And how do I day in and day out prioritize the relationship that I have with my kids, knowing that again and again and again they will test me and challenge me and question the things that I say rather than reacting in those moments. Can I show patience? And that patience comes from the perspective of recognizing how often, day in and day out, do I fall short of the life that God has called me to? Right? Day in and day out, the things I do, the things I say, the mistakes I make, recognizing that this is the standard that God calls us to, that I fall short every single day. And even though I fall short, what I receive from God is not condemnation, not frustration, not anger, but the loving patience of our Savior. And so I understand it's a hard standard to live up to. But what I want you to recognize is that God has painted the picture for us. He's given us an image of what it looks like for us to engage over and over again in those moments that our patience are tried. Paul finishes this thought in verse 7, and I think it's so fitting to what we're talking about. Paul says, look, love never gives up. It never loses faith. Love is always hopeful, and it endures through every circumstance. Paul's recognizing just the reality of relationships. That even though we love someone, that there are things that they say, things that they do that will challenge us, that will test us, that will try our patience. But the encouragement is to recognize that there's a long game at the forefront of us. And with love as the foundation, we never give up. With love as the foundation, relationship at the forefront, we never lose faith. That we remain hopeful, understanding that this love endures through every circumstance. I'm in this season with my kids where I've shared this before, one about to enter high school, one about to go into middle school, and it's been a really sweet season. There's been some ups and downs that are sort of the natural part of parenting, but I don't think we've really entered into those really difficult seasons that I think often happen when kids move out of the house and sort of you lose the daily interaction and connection and impact that you have on them. And so I've talked to a lot of parents who are like, man, when my kids moved out of the house is when I realized things have changed. And I don't have maybe as much control, or I don't have as much relational connection as I hoped that I would have. And so you walk through these difficult seasons where inevitably our kids make some choices that we think are the right choices, and they make some choices that we're like, that's not the choice I think you should have made. Those are the seasons that this principle is really played out. And I've talked to a lot of parents who've been through those seasons, and who've sort of come back on the other side of those seasons and found this to be true. That love never fails. That there might be a distance in your relationship. There might be some fracturing of that relationship. But the love that we have for our kids, the pursuit of our kids, the pursuit that is modeled by Jesus, is consistent and sustains us through all of life's circumstances. But that only happens if we parent with the long game in mind. Like I get, as parents, there's a temptation over and over again to be like, I'm done. Like I'm over. I'm frustrated. And when they're younger, it's like, I'm just going to walk away. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Like we separate instead of relationally leaning in. And every time we separate with our kids, there's a little damage that's done. And I'm not saying it's like an unrepairable damage, but there is a fracturing of that relationship. And I think it happens because in those moments we prioritize a point over the relationship that we have with our kids. Last year, a pastor in the Atlanta area named Andy Stanley, he and his wife Sandra wrote a book together. And the book is about parenting, and they talk a lot about this idea of parenting towards a goal. And they kind of put forth really what I think is an accurate sort of capturing of what I'm getting at in this point. This is what they said. This is their goal of parenting. They would say that our parenting goal was to end up with kids who wanted to be with us and with each other when they no longer had to be. And again, you're like, well, how is that a Christian goal? How does that make sense? You should want them to have a relationship with Jesus. Well, of course. Again, that's the principle here, right? You prioritize your relationship with Jesus so that your kids catch on to that, because more is caught than taught, that they prioritize a relationship with Jesus in their life. But then the second piece of that is you prioritize relationship so that your kids will want to be with you and with each other when they no longer have to be. And I know that as I say that, there are some of you here who have kids out of the house. And maybe you're experiencing the counter to that. I want to be clear. I'm not trying to make you feel bad for your parenting choices. Again, I mess up day in and day out. But what I would tell you is no matter how old your kids are, there's still an opportunity to get this right. Even if you've gone through a whole season of life where you've prioritized points and teachings more than relationships, there's still an opportunity to get it right. But it begins with your authenticity. It has to begin with you humbly going to your kids and saying, hey, look, I recognize I messed up. All parents mess up, but I messed up. And let me tell you a few ways that I messed up. And let me tell you why I'm telling you these things. Because I want to get it right. Because I value a relationship with you. That I want you to want to be with me. To be with your siblings when you no longer had to be. And so I'm committed to get this right. It's taking a long game approach. And as I mentioned before, I think it's so fitting because we see it continually in Jesus. As Christians, what we believe is we believe that when we come into a relationship with Jesus Christ, that He has covered our transgressions. The Bible's word is He's covered our sins, those parts of our life where we've missed the mark. But in that relationship, what we also receive is grace. Right? Like it's not that like we accept Jesus and then when we mess up, Jesus says, I'm done with you. Get away from me. Like you have no more part of me because you have made a mistake. No. What we see in the scriptures and what we know of the character of God is there's a constant pursuit after His people. He models for us what our parenting should look like. That we constantly pursue our relationship with God. We constantly pursue and prioritize our relationship with our kids. One of the things that we do as a church each and every week is we take some time to take communion together. And I get what happens when you do this week in and week out. You can almost lose the impact and the significance of what this moment is really about. It's not just a snack in the middle of church or today at the end. It's symbolic of God's pursuit after us. See, as Christians, we believe that God came to earth in the form of Jesus. And that Jesus surrendered His life on the cross to pay the penalty for the mistakes that we make. So that all of us could enter back into a relationship with God. Communion is a reminder of God prioritizing a relationship with His kids. And it cost Him everything. As a parent, you know, parenting is going to cost you everything. But there is a reward. And communion for me is a reminder of that reward. It's a reminder that because of Jesus, that we've been made whole. Because of Jesus, we have been made new. Because of what Jesus has done on the cross, we have an opportunity to step back into a relationship with God. So over the next few moments, I'm going to invite you to take communion. The cracker represents the body of Jesus. The juice represents His blood. It draws us to what happened on the cross and what He gave up for us. So over the next few moments, I'm going to invite you to take the cracker, to take the juice, to reflect and give thanks to God, gratitude for all that He's done for you. But also in that moment, just process how His example paves the way forward for our parenting. And then I'll come back and I'll close our time together in prayer. God, we thank you. We thank you for Jesus, for his sacrifice, for the way he gave of his life so that we might truly have life. And God, I pray that we would never take that for granted, that we would never just pass it off as something that happened, but understanding what Jesus did continually shapes our lives and our hearts day in and day out. God, I ask for your strength as we continue to strive to form ourselves into the likeness of your Son, Jesus. Knowing that we don't do it by our own, that we have the support and the help of your Spirit, God, but that is what we pursue. Understanding that our kids ultimately will reflect what they see. So God, I pray that we prioritize that relationship. But I also pray that we prioritize the relationship that we have with our kids. God, I thank you for the way that you've shown us a vision of what this looks like and gave us a goal to which we can all strive for. To love God and to love others. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.